Hey folks, Aestus here, back with another build for you guys. I call this build the Ultimate Cleric, first because it's kind of just a generic cleric, no special gimmicks or flavor, but also because it is the ultimate culmination of at least a half dozen full playthroughs with a full class cleric in my composition. I practically always have a full class cleric. It's a constant, a kind of default that better allows me to explore and compare other builds. So, like water smoothing out a stone, this build has become, over time, the one I consider strongest. In fact, I consider it an S tier build among the most powerful in the game. As always, I will start with a quick guide for the folks who just want the build without the blather. The Ultimate Cleric combines the Life Domain kit with on-heal items, Radiating Orb items, and lots of movement speed to single-handedly slam shut the doors of death for your entire party, all while dealing solid damage, both single target and AoE. For some of you, that's enough information for you to be able to execute the concept. I've linked a detailed spreadsheet of the build in the description. It includes a leveling guide, stats, and items. However, unlike my previous build videos, this one is really about the small choices and my rationale for making them rather than the broad concept. The broad concept of a Radiating Orb Life Cleric is something very simple and straightforward that you've probably tried before. So this video is really about getting into the details, digging into the weeds, so let's dig in. In my last build video, I discussed why I consider having a unit with at least 11 levels of either Sorcerer or Wizard to be practically mandatory. The same thing is true of Clerics for me, actually. A full class or near full class Cleric is so valuable at all points of the game that I never leave camp without one. So, like last time, let's go through each stage of the game and talk about what makes a Cleric invaluable for that stage. First, early game. Clerics are unique among classes in that they get some of their best items early in Act 1. I'm talking usually around levels 3 to 4. These items are Whispering Promise, Hellrider's Pride, and Luminous Armor. Starting with Whispering Promise, this ring you can buy from Volo when you first meet him in the Druid camp, so I literally get that at level 2. It applies 2 rounds of the Bless condition to all creatures that the wearer heals. This combines perfectly with the next major item, Hellrider's Pride, which is a set of gauntlets you get from Zevlor after resolving the Rite of Thorns. These gauntlets apply 2 rounds of the Blade Ward condition to all creatures that the wearer heals. Whispering Promise and Hellrider's Pride together will give each character you heal a plus 1d4 bonus to attack rolls and saving throws, and resistance to all physical damage. That is great. The only problem is that healing spells cost valuable spell slots, which are not abundant in the early game and are usually only single target, and that makes this strategy kind of whatever for all clerics that aren't Life Domain clerics. For Life Domain clerics, it's a completely different story because they get a channeled divinity called Preserve Life, which refreshes on a short rest and heals in a large AoE burst, and it scales exceptionally well with levels. It's actually character level instead of cleric level, but that's not really relevant to us. We're using this build as a full class cleric. Lastly, and most importantly by far, there is Luminous Armor, which you can find in a hidden room in the Selenite outpost in the Underdark. I always rush this outpost, partly to get this armor, but also because it's a source of early game experience, which you can collect at level 3 without fighting any difficult encounters. You get experience just for going there, and then you can also get experience for killing the Minotaur, which will charge the gates and die to the defenses of the outpost. The Luminous Armor is probably the best set of armor in the game. If you deal radiant damage while wearing it, you will proc Radiant Shockwave, which is unique to this item. Radiant Shockwave is basically the AoE version of Radiant Orb, a condition which severely debuffs enemy accuracy on attack rolls. So because it's AoE, when enemies cluster, if you deal radiant damage to each enemy in that cluster, it will proc Radiant Shockwave, which will also hit all of the others in the cluster, and it will combine to completely decimate their accuracy. Clerics are the best class to utilize Luminous Armor because they have the only spell lists that naturally get Spirit Guardians. The Radiant damage version of Spirit Guardians is the best spell for spreading Radiant Orb, and it's already an S tier spell without it. I think because of the existence of Luminous Armor, Spirit Guardians becomes one of the top 5 spells in the game. One of the interesting things about Spirit Guardians is that as a damaging aura, it actually weaponizes your movement speed, which is rare. More movement means more targets you can spread proc the spell on, right? And so for that reason, I always give my Clerics boots of speed, which you can get from Thulla in the Myconid quality again in the early game. So actually that's 4 items that are late game items for this build that we get before level 5. By the time you reach level 5, Cleric is locked in and online. For difficult encounters, cast Spirit Guardians, do your best Forrest Gump impression, and just spread Radiant Orb to as many targets as possible. In a pinch, you can use your Channel Divinity, Preserve Life, to heal for massive amounts, all while spreading Bless and Blade Ward. Altogether, it's just heaps of durability and utility. But even without all of that, Clerics still get some of the best low-level spells in the game. Spells like Sanctuary, Create Water, and Command remain high impact through your entire run. And for second level spells, you've got Hold Person, Warding Bond, and Aid, which are interesting because they're good when you get them, but they're actually even better in Act 3 than when you first get them in Act 1. And a lot of times, not because of the scaling of upcasting, just because of the inherent utility of the spell, right? Warding Bond is very good, except early game you don't have the resources to cast it on all members of your party effectively. By Act 3, you can do that and shrug off all of the damage, and that's why it's better, even though it's still just using a level 2 spell slot. Something similar goes with Hold Person, right? Hold Person paralyzes a target, which means it's going to scale with the value of the target. And then by late game, you can build your DC much higher to more reliably hit it. Anyways, I'm ranting now. All of this is just to say that Clerics are very, very good early game, and they stay good throughout the game. Let's move on now to mid-game, roughly around late Act 1, early Act 2. Not much really changes for the Ultimate Cleric build in this part of the game, but it does feel like it changes just because of how effective Radiant damage is in Act 2. A lot of enemies in this act are just weak to Radiant damage and to Radiating Orb Light. So you get that feeling like when you pick Charmander as your starter, and it's kind of a grind until you get to Celadon and you face Erica's Grass-type gem, and then even though Charmander was probably good all along, it really starts to shine just because of the encounters you're facing. It's the same thing here, right? Radiant damage is just good in this act. I don't know how else to say it. At this part of the game, you can also start stacking your Constitution saving throw high enough that you can really cast Warding Bond on multiple targets without any real danger of dropping concentration. Finally, we get to Act 3, or late game, and believe it or not, Clerics get even better at this point of the game. This is when we get Hero's Feast, insane durability boost, especially on summon comps. We can combine that with upcasted Aid, and now we are handing every member of our party over 40 extra maximum HP for their entire long rest. And speaking of long rests, late game Clerics also get Divine Intervention. And it feels to me like I'm the only one who talks about how insane this ability is, probably because I'm the main guy popularizing the idea of limiting long rests as a way to measure success. Which, by the way, this is a side rant, but I want to say it. Limiting long rest isn't something I just made up. It's built into the game. Like, it's fundamentally an assumption of the system. You know how you can just tell what a thing is for just by looking at its design? Right? Like, knives are about cutting. Ladders are about climbing. You can tell just by looking at them. In the same way, D&D 5e and Baldur's Gate 3 is about resource management. Everything in its design points to that as one of the main ways to interact with the game. And limiting long rests is the best measure of success for how efficiently you are using your resources. So just a lot of people act like it's just some arbitrary rule that I limit long rests. In my opinion, it isn't. It's just a natural way to measure how well you are interacting with the game. Now, returning to Divine Intervention, It gives you all the effects of a long rest for your entire party without ever taking a long rest. So it's just saving one long rest per run, and that's honestly pretty amazing. It's a one-time usability, but that's enough. If there were more uses, it would be way too good. With Divine Intervention, the House of Hope, and good routing, you should be able to complete all of Act 3 using 0 to 1 long rests, even with my rule set. In the future, I'd like to make a video which really outlines kind of my routing and shows you how I do this, but I don't know if I'll ever even get to that. Either way, Divine Intervention, absolutely amazing. It's another reason why Clerics are just mandatory in the late game. Put all these together, and Clerics are just instantly good and get better each act. That's why I consider them mandatory as a unit for every run. Okay, so we've established what makes Clerics mandatory, and that also introduced several build goals we have for this class. Basically, just to say them explicitly, these goals are: first, build to never drop concentration, and we do this in order to maximize Spirit Guardian. That is kind of made more difficult by point 2, which is build to never die, so we can cast Warding Bond on as many allies as possible. Warding Bond does make it more likely that you'll drop concentration, so we'll need very high Constitution saving throw boosts and also very high durability on this build. Once those goals are achieved, we can try to grab as much damage as we can so that the build isn't dead weight in the damage department. Although, to be honest, just the passive damage you'll get from Spirit Guardians is going to be pretty high. It's spread out really thin, so we'd like to find a good source of single target damage that we can use reliably and consistently. With these goals in mind, let's go through my recommendations for which gear to pick for each item slot. This isn't something I usually do in my build videos. I usually focus on the core synergies and just leave the rest to my spreadsheet. But like I said at the beginning, this video is a little different in that it's not about the concept, it is actually about the minutia. So let's really look at it in minute details with each item slot. Starting with armor, we'll start with this because we already talked about it. This build is going to use luminous armor. We are never going to swap it out. There just isn't a better armor set in the game for this build. We can also rule out our first ring slot that we're going to fill with Whispering Promise, which we've already talked about. This is another item that we will keep for the entire run. Since we talked about our first ring, let's talk about what we want in our second ring slot, because it actually synergizes with Whispering Promise, and this is the Ring of Regeneration. The Ring of Regeneration you can buy from the Sorcerer's Sundries in Act 3. It's well known to synergize with Whispering Promise. I've talked about it in other videos. Basically, Ring of Regeneration gives you a passive 1/4 healing every round, which will proc your Whispering Promise Bless on heal effect, giving you a permanent Bless while you are in combat. Remember, Bless gives you a plus 1d4 to saving throws, which helps you in never dropping concentration. For Act 3, I use Crusher's Ring in this slot. It will give you more movement speed, which is then doubled whenever you dash each round, so it will help you spread Radiant Orb much better. This brings us naturally to the glove slot, which we already said was going to be Hellrider's Pride. We actually technically do switch out Hellrider's Pride once we get to Act 3. We switch it for the Reviving Hands, but it's only because the Reviving Hands are just a slightly better version of Hellrider's Pride. I mean, they're pretty much the same. The extra things that the Reviving Hands gives you aren't that valuable in my rule set, so it's not super important. Early game, before we can afford to cast Warding Bond on everybody, these gloves will give physical resistance to the allies we heal, which is quite good. Late game, that becomes redundant, right? Because once everyone has Warding Bond, double stacking resistances doesn't actually do anything, but we still want that in our glove slot because of the passive healing we've already said we're going to get from Ring of Regeneration. Will also proc Hellrider's Pride and the Reviving Hands. Now, along with being permanently blessed, we are also permanently resistant to all physical damage, which is awesome. Next up is Boots. For the Boots slot, I recommend Boots of Speed. Again, we touched on this. This is better for spreading Radiating Orb through Spirit Guardians. And that covers all of the items that we discussed before. Now moving on to new territory, let's start with the Helmet slot. We're starting here because it's interesting. Helmets are the item slot where casters usually get their arcane acuity, right? I'm actually going to recommend foregoing arcane acuity on the ultimate cleric. Really, it's not as important for clerics because a lot of what we do, for example, radiating orb, create water, sanctuary aid, etc., these things don't have a DC. And remember, there's only 2 powerful arcane acuity items in the game, right? Helm of Arcane Acuity and Hat of Fire Acuity. These are the really abusable ones. And both are better off on other members of the party. So I recommend the Ultimate Cleric, even though it's a caster, you should probably not build for Arcane Acuity. So instead, we are going to use the Helm of Boldurin. It'll give us more healing, +1 to our armor class and saving throws, and immunity to critical hits, all very valuable durability for us. You can get the Helm of Boldurin in the altar behind Anzur. That is pretty late game though, so before that I use the Holy Lance Helm. It works really well with this build concept, but that's pretty well known by folks. I don't think we need to dive into it. For our next slot, I recommend the Amulet of the Devout. It gives an extra use of our Channel Divinity, which is amazing. Preserve Life is incredible. And it also gives us a +2 to our spell DC, which we actually want since we don't have Arcane Acuity stacks, right? Spell DC is usually something you don't build for because Arcane Acuity just takes care of all of that. But in this particular build, it's actually worth it, and a +2 from a single item is great. It's just a decent amulet in general, and it only really works for clerics, so you might as well use it on your cleric and then save other really good amulets for other members of your party. You can buy the Amulet of the Devout from the Stormshore Tabernacle in the lower city. That brings us to Cloak next. Cloak is a low impact item slot on most builds. For the Ultimate Cleric, I recommend wearing the Cloak of Protection. You can also do that one, I think it's called the Cloak of Displacement, which kind of blurs you. Both are good. I prefer the Cloak of Protection though because it gives you saving throws, which again is very important for us. But if you want the Cloak of Protection on someone else, Cloak of Displacement is a fine alternative. You can buy the Cloak of Protection from the Last Light Inn. I can't remember which vendor it is, but one of the vendors in the Last Light Inn will sell it to you. One other thing I like about the Cloak of Protection is that for some reason this build ends up utilizing a lot of the legacy items from the original Baldur's Gate series, right? So altogether, we have now the Cloak of Protection, Boots of Speed, Ring of Regeneration, and Helm of Boldurin. All of these were items from the original series, which is pretty neat. Next up, our Elixir slot. Pretty much all game, the best in slot for this is the Elixir of Peerless Focus. Although, I've had some builds where it's frustratingly difficult to get them, especially with my rules that forbid crafting potions, where if you just have to buy and you have limited long rests, you can't guarantee them in shop. I mean, really, the Elixir of Peerless Focus is kind of crucial to this build maintaining concentration, because if you don't, you will drop concentration roughly every 1 in 20 hits, which stacks up when you've cast Warding Bond on every member of your party. So if you can't find enough Elixirs of Peerless Focus late game, I recommend swapping the Helm of Boldurin for the Steel Watcher's helmet as soon as you can. So that's all of the main items. Now that's all that's left is weapons. Your weapon slots. And this is an interesting part of the build. Let's start with discussing the offhand melee slot. I recommend using Swire's Sledboard here. This will give us Force Conduit every round, which is a stacking flat damage reduction against physical damage. Because we want to cast Warding Bond on everybody, we can expect to tank heaps of low damage hits. And against those, even a very low amount of DR could go a long way. That's flat damage reduction, by the way. So just as an example, if you reduce a 2 damage hit to a 0 damage hit, you change the concentration saving throw from DC 10 to not needing to save at all, and that is honestly huge. You can buy Swire's Sledboard from the Rivington General. Before Act 3, I always use the Adamantine Shield. It spreads reeling when enemies miss you, which synergizes beautifully with Radiant Orb, and it also makes you immune to critical hits before you get the Helm of Boldurin. For our main hand, there's really one choice that stands out above all the others, and that is the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. When you kill an enemy while wielding the staff, you will get a charge of Life Essence. Life Essence can be used to cast any spell from the Necromancy School. One of the best spells in Baldur's Gate 3 to abuse this is Inflict Wounds, which scales wonderfully when upcast. We'll be collecting a lot of Life Essence through the Spirit Guardian's damage anyways, so being able to just on occasion slap an enemy for 8 die 10 damage is awesome, especially when you consider you're not expending a spell slot for that. I mean, it's huge. You can get the Staff of Cherished Necromancy by killing Mystic Carrion in the lower city. Before then, I will usually use Morning Frost or the Blood of Lathander, depending on team composition. Morning Frost is better. For Clerics, what it does is it gives you Ray of Frost, which is early game a better attack cantrip than Sacred Flame. And then every once in a while, you'll proc that Chilled condition, in which case you can cast Create Water and freeze a target, which is really, really good. But Morning Frost is just a great item on a lot of builds. So if there's another member of the party that wants to use Morning Frost, I'll usually then go Blood of Lathander. And then finally, the last slot is the ranged weapon slot. Obviously, we aren't a ranged weapon attacker, so we're just looking for a stat stick to fill this slot. The clear winner is Darkfire Shortbow, which you can buy from Dammon in Act 2. This bow gives you resistance to 2 very common elemental damage types, fire and cold, and it gives you the ability to cast haste once per long rest, which is honestly pretty decent if you can remember to use it. I almost always forget for some reason. So now that we've discussed every item slot and how to fill it, let's talk about the items that are conspicuously not there. First, why not Luminous Gloves and Coruscation Ring? The short answer is that Luminous Armor is just enough. You don't really need more Radiant Orb than what you can get with Luminous Armor. The longer answer is that while the Ultimate Cleric will benefit a lot from those items, Luminous Glove and Coruscation Ring, it doesn't benefit from them more than other builds you are likely to use. So consider, Luminous Gloves are good on any unit that deals consistent radiant damage. Think of monks, think of paladins. It can be just as good on all of those builds. Whereas Hellrider's Pride is uniquely good for Life Clerics. Likewise, Coruscation Ring is good on the Ultimate Cleric, but it's even better on units that spam spells like Eldritch Blast, Magic Missile, or Scorching Ray. In other words, the Radiating Orb items are extremely good, but that doesn't mean you have to stack them all in a single build like this one. Lots of builds can utilize them, so spread them out. That said, if you don't have another build that utilizes Luminous Gloves and Coruscation Ring, then they are worth using on this build. They can definitely be best in slot at certain times of the game. So just as a quick guide, I replaced Hellrider's Pride with Luminous Gloves in Act 2, but I'll still go back to Reviving Hands in Act 3. By Act 3 is usually where I feel tanky enough that I can cast Warding Bond on every target. It's when you get Ring of Regeneration to consistently proc that resistance on yourself. And in that situation, it's better to have the resistance than the Luminous Gloves. For the Coruscation Ring, you can use it instead of Crusher's Ring in the mid-game. And it can also replace Ring of Regeneration as well once you get the Helm of Balduran to proc the healing. So you can swap it in and out depending on your situation. I've also heard of people stacking reverberation items like Gloves of the Belligerent Sky and Boots of Stormy Clamor on their clerics as well. On its face, clerics seem like really good candidates for these awesome items, just because they're dealing so much radiant damage. So let's talk about why I actually don't recommend doing this. Again, this is just a case of good items that are better on other units. Reverberation is the kind of condition you want to concentrate to high amounts on a single unit. You don't really want to spread it in low amounts to lots of units. This is because you only really need it on a rare single target condition like Frozen or Chilled, so you can see my Ice Knight as an example of a build that utilizes these things. For everything else in the game, Arcane Acuity is usually enough, and you don't really need to debuff enemy saving throws even more. If you slap Reverberation items on Clerics, they'll spread Reverberation, but just wide and in low numbers. Put those same items on an Eldritch Blaster, and now you can rapidly stack it on a specific target. You can sometimes proc for Prone if you like to kite targets. I do that all the time. So I just think Eldritch Blasters are a better unit for your reverberation gear. By contrast, Hellrider's Pride and Boots of Speed, which are the alternatives that I recommend you taking, give you much, much more and are less likely to be effectively utilized by other units. But as always, all of these recommendations are context specific. So depending on your team composition, you could go for the reverberation items instead of the ones I recommend. Although I will say, I think that's rare for the reverberation items. I am mostly just opposed to using them on your cleric. Alright, we've talked a lot. Let's summarize. In Baldur's Gate 3, there are basically 3 vectors of durability. They are hit points, armor class, and saving throws. The Ultimate Cleric massively boosts all 3, both for itself and your entire party. So let's go through them one by one, starting with hit points. For hit points, the Ultimate Cleric has Aid, Hero's Feast, Preserve Life, and Warding Bond. By the way, the resistances on Warding Bond, you can see those as doubling the effectiveness of your hit points. That's why I've grouped them into the hit points category. For armor class, you spread Radiating Orb, Reeling for most of the game, and again, Warding Bond will give +1 AC to all the units that you cast it on. Again, Radiating Orb and Reeling aren't directly buffing your armor class, but they are indirectly buffing it by lowering enemy accuracy. Then if we go to saving throws, there is Bless on heal, and again, Warding Bond, which gives +1 to the saving throws of every unit that you cast it on. So that's all 3 vectors. Each of these, we're giving boosts both to ourselves and to our allies. Of course, when it comes to yourself, there is the exception of Warding Bond. Warding Bond, you can't cast that on yourself, obviously. But durability isn't a problem with this build. It doesn't really need Warding Bond cast on it because, I mean, if we go through just for its personal durability buffs, this build has resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, slashing, fire, and cold damage. It has a passive 1d4 +2 healing per round, and it has Permabless, and items which boost your saving throws for a total of 1d4 +2 to your saving throws to all of your saving throws. With all of these things, the overall durability of your entire team goes up so much that you're basically just able to take one cleric and then go glass cannon on everybody else. Now this is normally the time of my build videos where I would talk about damage and DPR calculations, and we're not going to do that for this one, mostly because it's not really the point of the Ultimate Cleric, and also this video is going a bit long. Nevertheless, if you are interested in that, in the spreadsheet of this build I have linked in the description, I do include a DPR tab where I have some very rudimentary calculations on the damage you can expect from Spirit Guardians per target that you proc it on, and also for upcasted inflict wounds. The damage is decent for a build that's doing everything else other than damage, but it's definitely not your primary striker build since they fixed the bug with Staff of Cherished Necromancy. Anyways, if that interests you guys, please do check that out. Otherwise, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, you guys. I hope you enjoy the build, and I will catch you next time.